The letter hit the floorboards of the Bancroft ranch house with a sound like a gunshot. Mae Quinn stood in the center of the room she had traveled 900 miles to reach, her travel-worn carpetbag still clutched in both hands, and she stared at Simon Bancroft with eyes that held no fear, only a fury so controlled it was more terrifying than any rage she had ever witnessed on the streets of St. Louis. The letter lay between them on the rough-hewn floor, the letter that changed everything. The letter that exposed the trap she had walked straight into with her eyes wide open, because nobody had told her the truth about what settling the Bancroft estate actually meant. "You knew," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was the most dangerous kind of quiet, the kind that came before something irreversible. Simon Bancroft stood 6 feet and 2 inches of sun-bronzed rancher with dark eyes that had seen too many droughts and too many graves, and right now those dark eyes were carrying a guilt so heavy it bent him slightly forward at the shoulders, like a man bracing against a wind only he could feel. He was 31 years old and he looked every year of it in this moment. "Me, do not say my name like that." She set the carpetbag down, very deliberately, pressed her hands flat against her skirt to stop them trembling. "Your attorney wrote to me and said you needed a wife to manage the household accounts and assume legal co-ownership of the estate so that your uncle's will could be satisfied. That is what the letter said. That is what I agreed to. That is what the arrangement was. But it is not all the arrangement was." She picked up the letter from the floor. She had found it tucked behind a ledger on the desk in the study, the ink still crisp, addressed to a man named Harlan Cade in Tucson, Arizona. The date on it was 2 weeks before Simon Bancroft had first contacted the matrimonial agency in St. Louis, 2 weeks before he had sent for a wife at all. The letter described, in Simon's own handwriting, a plan, a very specific plan, one that involved a woman who would sign documents without asking too many questions, assume the legal liability of several contested land parcels, and then, once the deed transfers were complete, have no further standing to object to whatever Simon decided to do with the estate. The plan, in Simon's own handwriting, had called her a solution, not a wife, a solution. "You sent for a wife," Mae said, "because you needed a signature, and you needed someone from far enough away that she would not know the history of this land. Someone who would arrive here and feel obligated and grateful and small enough to do exactly what you told her." The silence in the Bancroft ranch house was the loudest thing Mae had ever heard. She had come from St. Louis with $40, a carpetbag, 3 cotton dresses, 1 good wool coat, a copy of Jane Eyre with a broken spine, and the absolute conviction that she was walking toward something better than the life she was leaving. She was 26 years old. She had buried her father 6 months ago and spent the months since watching his debts eat the house she had grown up in. She had no illusions about the romance of matrimonial agencies. She had gone in with clear eyes and a practical heart, but she had not gone in expecting to be used as a legal instrument. "Explain it to me," she said. "Explain all of it, because I am still standing in your house, Simon Bancroft, and I have not yet decided what I am going to do next. But I will tell you this. Whatever you say in the next 5 minutes will determine whether I walk back out that door or whether I hear you out, and I would choose your words with great care." That was how Mae Quinn arrived at the Bancroft Ranch in Redemption, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883. And that was how, in the first 20 minutes of her arrival, she fundamentally changed the terms of everything. The story of how she got there began 3 weeks earlier, on the train platform in St. Louis, Missouri, where Mae had stood in the gray April rain and looked at the westbound ticket in her hand as though it were both a life raft and an anchor. She had answered the matrimonial notice in the St. Louis Dispatch because Mrs. Abernathy at the agency had told her that a Mr. Simon Bancroft of Redemption, New Mexico Territory, was a man of property and serious reputation, not prone to vice, not given to drink, and in need of a practical woman to help manage a substantial cattle estate left to him by his uncle, Cornelius Bancroft, who had died the previous November. The will had stipulated, in one of those maddening legal provisions that lawyers seem to invent specifically to cause misery, that the estate could only pass in full to Simon if he was married within 6 months of his uncle's death. Single, he would inherit only the house and 40 acres. Married, he would inherit the full 1,200 acres, the cattle operation, the water rights, and the associated grazing contracts. Mae had known all of this. Mrs. Abernathy had been straightforward about the arrangement. It was a legal marriage of practical convenience. The woman who agreed to it would receive a home, financial security, and legal status as co-owner of the estate. Simon Bancroft had specifically requested a woman of education and independent character, which Mrs. Abernathy had said was unusual but refreshing in a man of his circumstances. What Mrs. Abernathy had not known, because Simon Bancroft had not told her, was the rest of it. The rest of it was a man named Harlan Cade. Harlan Cade was 43 years old and operated out of Tucson, and he had been the business partner of Cornelius Bancroft for the better part of a decade. When Cornelius died, Harlan Cade believed, with considerable justification based on a series of private agreements he and Cornelius had made, that he was entitled to a substantial portion of the Bancroft grazing lands, specifically the southern parcels along the Rio Malpais, where the best grass grew and the water ran reliable even in drought years. Cornelius's will had not reflected those private agreements. Cornelius's will had left everything to Simon. And Harlan Cade was not a man who accepted being left out of an inheritance graciously. He had filed a legal challenge within 2 weeks of Cornelius's death. His attorney in Santa Fe had argued that the private agreements between Cade and Cornelius constituted a prior claim that superseded the will. Simon's attorney had countered that no such agreements had ever been formally recorded and that the will was unambiguous. The case was grinding through the territorial courts with the speed of cold molasses, and meanwhile the 6-month deadline on Simon's marriage clause was approaching like a locomotive with no brakes. This was the situation into which Mae Quinn had stepped, and the letter she had found in the study had revealed to her that Simon had, at some point in the process of this legal nightmare, considered a strategy that was much darker than simply finding a wife to satisfy his uncle's will. The letter to Harlan Cade, written 2 weeks before Simon had contacted the matrimonial agency, had been a letter of proposal. Not the romantic kind, a business proposal. Simon had proposed to Cade that the dispute could be resolved if Cade agreed to drop his legal challenge and instead enter a formal partnership agreement on the southern parcels. In exchange, Simon had offered to arrange the marriage in such a way that the wife he brought in would hold legal title to the contested parcels in her name alone, which would effectively remove those parcels from the dispute and create a separate legal entity that neither Simon nor Cade's claims could reach. It was a complicated maneuver, and reading it in the study, Mae had understood with cold clarity that it would have left her holding land she did not truly own in any meaningful sense, exposed to whatever legal battle Cade decided to wage next, while Simon protected his primary assets. The letter had never been sent. Mae had noticed that. There was no postal mark on it. It was a draft. A possibility Simon had considered and apparently set aside. That distinction mattered. It was not a small distinction. When Mae said, "Explain it to me," and Simon Bancroft stood in the center of his uncle's house in the last light of an April evening in New Mexico territory, what he did next was not what she expected. He sat down on the edge of the stone hearth with the look of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally decided the weight was not worth the effort of pretending it was manageable. "I wrote that letter in January," he said, 6 weeks after my uncle died. I was in debt, the legal challenge had just been filed, and I had a deadline bearing down on me that I could see no clean way through. I was desperate. I wrote it. I sat with it for 2 days, and then I burned the copy I meant to send, and I put that draft in the ledger because I am the kind of man who keeps his mistakes where he can see them so he does not make them again. Mee studied him. You kept a record of your worst impulse. Yes. Why? He looked at her. Because I was afraid if I destroyed it entirely, I would talk myself into believing I had never been tempted by it. And I had been. I was. And I thought a man should be honest with himself about what he is capable of, even when it is not flattering. Me sat down on the chair nearest the window. Outside, the New Mexico sky was doing something extraordinary with the last of the sunlight, turning the mesa walls the color of hot iron, but she was not looking at the sky. She was looking at Simon Bancroft, and she was applying to him the same precise, unsparing analysis she had applied to every situation that had ever required her to make a choice under pressure. "Tell me about Harlan Cade," she said. "Tell me everything. Leave nothing out." So he did. It took the better part of an hour. Simon told her about the years his uncle Cornelius had spent building the ranch from a quarter section of rocky ground into something worth fighting over. He told her about the partnership with Cade, which had begun genuinely enough as a grazing arrangement, but had grown complicated as Cade's ambitions expanded and Cornelius's health declined. He told her about the private agreements Cornelius had described to him in the last months of his life, agreements Cornelius had ultimately decided not to formalize because he had come to distrust Cade's intentions toward the water rights. He told her about the will and the marriage clause, which Cornelius had inserted with the full knowledge that it would force Simon to plant roots, because Cornelius had worried for years that his nephew had the soul of a wanderer and would sell the ranch the moment he inherited it without a compelling reason to stay. "Your uncle used the will to try to change who you are," Mee said. "He used the will to try to give me a reason to stay and become who he thought I could be." Simon paused. "I am not sure those are entirely different things." Mee looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "And what did you intend for me, originally, before you decided not to send the letter?" He did not look away from her when he answered. She gave him credit for that. "I intended to satisfy the will's requirements, to bring in a wife who would be a genuine legal partner in the estate. The letter to Cade was a separate plan, a worse plan that I abandoned. When I contacted the matrimonial agency, I had already abandoned it. But you still needed a wife who would not ask too many questions. I needed a wife who was practical and capable, and could handle the reality of this situation without being frightened off by it," he said. "The agency description said you were educated, self-sufficient, and not given to sentimentality. I thought those were the qualities that would serve us both best." Me absorbed this. It was honest. It was not particularly flattering to either of them, but it was honest, and honesty in a man, particularly in a man who was at a disadvantage and knew it, was not something she took lightly. "I have $40 to my name," she said. "My return ticket would cost $32. If I leave, I have $8 and nowhere specific to go. I know. Do not mistake my staying for forgiveness. I won't. And do not mistake my practicality for weakness. I am staying because I am choosing to stay, and the fact that my options are limited does not change the fact that the choice is mine." Simon Bancroft looked at Mae Quinn across the stone hearth in the fading New Mexico light, and something shifted in his face. Not quite relief. Something more careful than relief. Something that looked, if you were watching closely enough, like the beginning of respect. The marriage had been performed 3 days after Mee's arrival by the circuit preacher, Reverend Horace Dunlap, who came through redemption every 6 weeks and who had a handshake like a vice and a voice built for open country. It was a brief, legal, and entirely unsentimental ceremony conducted in the parlor of the ranch house, with the station manager from the trading post and his wife as witnesses. Mee wore her good wool coat over her second-best dress, because the April mornings in New Mexico were cold in ways she had not anticipated, and Simon wore a clean shirt and an expression of concentrated gravity that she was beginning to understand was simply how his face looked when he was paying serious attention to something. There was no celebration afterward. Mee had not expected one. They shook hands with Reverend Dunlap. signed the legal documents that Simon's attorney Edgar Whitmore had prepared, and then the Reverend and the station manager and his wife departed, and me and Simon Bancroft stood in the parlor of the ranch house as husband and wife, with 1,200 acres of contested New Mexico grassland between them and the nearest town 11 miles away. "I have put fresh linens on the bedroom in the east wing," Simon said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the documents in his hands with the studied focus of a man who needed something to do with his eyes. "The ranch hands sleep in the bunkhouse. I will take the study. The study has a couch." "A cot," me nodded. "That is sensible." She picked up her carpetbag from the corner where she had set it that first evening. "I would like to begin reviewing the estate accounts tomorrow morning. If I am to be a legal partner in this operation, I want to understand what we actually own and what is contested. I can have Whitmore send the full file. I can read the ledgers myself," she said. "I kept my father's books for 12 years. I know what a set of accounts looks like." Simon looked at her then, really looked at her in the direct, assessing way he had that she was starting to recognize as his version of careful attention. "All right," he said. "The ledgers are in the study. You can start whenever you like." She started that evening after supper, sitting at the desk in the study while Simon sat on the cot behind her reading a seed catalog and making occasional notes in the margins with a pencil stub. The coexistence was strange and not particularly comfortable, but it was not hostile, and me had decided that not hostile was a reasonable foundation. The ledgers were a revelation. Cornelius Bancroft had been a meticulous record keeper, which me appreciated, and the story the numbers told was both more encouraging and more complicated than she had expected. The cattle operation was genuinely profitable. The grazing contracts were solid. The water rights, the ones Cade was most interested in, were the linchpin of the entire operation. Without reliable water access on the southern parcels, the summer grazing capacity of the ranch dropped by nearly 40%. With it, the Bancroft operation was one of the most efficient in that part of the territory. She could see exactly why Harlan Cade wanted those parcels. She could also see something else. "Simon," she said. He looked up from the seed catalog. "These water rights. The documents Cornelius filed in 1877. They are registered in the territorial records. They should be. Whitmore handled the registration. And the agreements Cade is claiming existed, the private ones Cornelius described to you. Did Cornelius ever put anything in writing about those? Not in Cade's favor, but anything at all that documented the nature of their arrangement?" Simon put down the seed catalog. He came to stand beside the desk and looked at the ledger she was pointing to. It was from 1879. There were 2 entries in November of that year that referenced payments to something listed only as the Southern Partnership account. "I have never seen those entries before," he said. "Your uncle was meticulous," me said. "He did not write Southern Partnership account because he was being vague. He wrote it because that was what he called it, which means there was an account, which means there are likely records of what went into it and where those funds went." Simon sat down on the edge of the desk. The proximity was sudden and me was acutely aware of it, the warmth of him in the cool study air, the way he leaned to see what she was seeing with an intensity that was entirely focused on the ledger and entirely, she realized, on what she had found. He was not performing interest. He was genuinely electrified by it. "If we can find the account records," he said slowly, "we can document what Cade's actual financial contribution to the partnership was, and what Cornelius's was, and whether Cade ever had any legitimate claim to the water rights specifically, or whether his claim was always to the grazing profits, which is a very different thing legally." Simon looked at her. The lamp was between them and it lit his face from below, which should have been unflattering but somehow was not. "Where did you learn to read accounts like this?" "My father was an importer. I kept his books from the time I was 14. She turned a page in the ledger. "He was not a careful man, but I made his accounts careful for him. It is a useful education." His voice was different. She looked up. "I am aware that I have not given you a great deal of reason to invest yourself in this situation." "No," she agreed, "you have not. But what you are doing right now," he started again. "I did not send for a wife with this expectation. I want you to know that. I did not expect a partner," she said. "You expected a signature and a capable housekeeper and someone to satisfy the legal requirement." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I am ashamed of that." Me looked at him steadily. "Then do not waste my time being ashamed. Use it differently." He nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting the terms of a treaty he has not fully read yet but intends to honor. The weeks that followed were extraordinary in ways me had not anticipated, because the Bancroft Ranch, stripped of her preconceptions about it, was genuinely impressive. 1,200 acres of high desert grassland in the shadow of the Malpai Ridge, with a creek that ran clear from snowmelt until late June, and the best-managed cattle herd me had ever seen, though admittedly her cattle experience was limited. Simon had 12 ranch hands, most of whom had worked for Cornelius before him, and they were a collection of men she found deeply interesting. There was Tomás Reyes, the foreman, who was 40 years old and had been born on a rancho near Las Cruces, and knew the land the way other men knew scripture. There was a man everyone called Old Pete, who was at least 60, and whose primary function appeared to be knowing exactly when it was about to rain. There was a young man named Felix who was from Illinois and had come west 2 years ago, and still looked slightly surprised by most of what the territory offered. Me learned the ranch the way she had learned everything that mattered to her, systematically and with total commitment. She rose before dawn because that was when Simon rose and when the work started, and she was not willing to be a woman who slept through the business she legally co-owned. She learned which horses were reliable and which were not, and she learned to ride the reliable ones well enough that, by the 3rd week, Tomás Reyes told Simon in her hearing that Mrs. Bancroft had a good seat and an even better head, which she understood was high praise. The dynamic between her and Simon was careful and strange, and charged with a kind of electricity that neither of them was prepared to examine directly. They worked well together. That was the foundation. They were both practical and direct, and neither of them was interested in social performance, which meant they could sit across a supper table and talk about water rights and cattle prices, and the vagaries of territorial law without either of them needing the conversation to be something else. But occasionally, it would be something else. Occasionally, she would look up from a ledger and find him watching her with an expression she could not quite categorize, and she would hold the gaze for one beat longer than was strictly necessary before looking back down. Occasionally, he would say something that was not about the ranch at all, something small and observational, about the way the sunset looked on the mesa wall or about a passage in the book she kept on the parlor table, and the observation would be so unexpectedly precise and gentle that it would catch her entirely off guard. The hidden motive she had feared in him, the calculating strategist of that unsent letter, was present, but it was not the whole of him, and the more she understood the whole of him, the more complicated her feelings became. The legal situation with Harlan Cade came to a head in the 5th week of me's residence at the Bancroft Ranch, when Cade himself rode in. She was in the yard with Tomás reviewing the tally from the spring count when a rider came down the road from the direction of the highway, followed by 2 other men, and she knew before Simon emerged from the barn that the rider in front was not a local. He was too well dressed for the country, too deliberate in his approach. Harlan Cade was a compact man of medium height with the kind of eyes that were always calculating the distance between where things were and where he wanted them to be. He wore a good coat and a hat that had cost money, and he rode a horse that was worth more than most men's yearly wages. He looked at me when she appeared, and his expression did something quick and assessing that she did not like at all. "You must be the bride," he said. He did not dismount. "I am Mae Bancroft," she said, "and you must be Harlan Cade." Something flickered in his eyes. Word travels. In a ranch house with a thorough set of ledgers, word does not need to travel, she said. It is already there. Simon came out of the barn at a measured pace that Mae recognized as deliberately unhurried, the pace of a man who was not going to show alarm even if he felt it. "Cade," he said. "Bancroft." Cade looked between them. "I came to make a proposal. You have an attorney for proposals." "My attorney makes proposals that cost both of us money." Cade swung down from his horse with the ease of long practice. His two companions stayed mounted. Mae noted that both of them were wearing sidearms prominently and that this was probably intentional. "I thought we might speak like men who have a common interest in resolving this without further expense." "Come inside," Simon said. "The lady, too." "Mrs. Bancroft is a legal co-owner of this estate," Simon said. "Any proposal you make to me is a proposal to her as well." Cade smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Of course." They sat in the parlor, which Mae had arranged in the weeks since her arrival into something that actually resembled a room people used rather than a showpiece no one entered. Simon sat in the chair nearest the window and Mae sat across from him, which put Cade on the settee between them, and she was pleased with this positioning because it meant Cade could not watch both of them at once. Cade's proposal was, on the surface, reasonable. He was willing to drop the legal challenge in exchange for a 10-year grazing lease on the southern parcels at a rate he described as fair market value. He would pay in advance for the first 2 years. Simon looked at Mae. Mae looked at Cade. "What is your proposed rate per acre?" she said. Cade named a figure. Mae wrote it in the small notebook she had taken to carrying. "And the water access," she said. "Joint use," Cade said. "Seasonal rotation. Whose schedule, mutually agreed upon annually." Mae wrote that down too. Then she said, "Mr. Cade, I have been reviewing my uncle's ledgers since I arrived here. There are entries from 1879 and 1880 that reference a Southern Partnership account. Would you be able to tell me what funds went into that account and under what terms?" The change in Cade's face was small, but she caught it. Something tightened around his eyes. "That account was related to a private arrangement between myself and Cornelius," he said carefully. "It has no direct bearing on the current." "I think it may have considerable bearing," Mae said pleasantly. "Because if that account was structured as a service payment rather than an equity investment, which is what the ledger entries suggest, then the private agreements you are claiming constituted a prior claim, were actually compensation already received. And a claim that has already been paid out is not a claim." The silence in the parlor was very large. Simon was looking at Mae with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She would think about that expression later in the quiet of her room, and she would identify it eventually as wonder. Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Simon. "Your wife," he said, "is a dangerous woman." "She is," Simon said, and the pride in his voice was something he clearly had not intended to allow to show. Cade left without an agreement. He was not ready to surrender ground on the basis of an argument he had not anticipated, and Mae had not expected him to capitulate in the room. But she had established something important. She had established that the Bancrofts knew where to look. That evening, Simon and Mae sat across from each other in the study, with the 1879 and 1880 ledgers open between them and the lamp burning low, and the coyotes starting their conversation somewhere out in the dark country beyond the creek. Simon had sent Felix to town the previous week with a message to Edgar Whitmore about locating the bank records for the Southern Partnership account, and Whitmore had replied that he believed the records existed and were held at the Territorial Bank in Las Cruces. "If Whitmore can get copies of those records," Mae said, "and they show what I think they show, Cade's legal challenge falls apart. He accepted payment. He cannot also claim equity." "You identified all of this in 6 weeks," Simon said. He was not really talking about the legal situation. He was looking at her in that way again, the way that had started as careful assessment and had become something she did not have a clean word for yet. "I identified it because your uncle's records were good," she said. "I only put the pieces in order." "Me." He said her name and then stopped, and the stopping was more eloquent than whatever words he had been reaching for. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night wind moved through the high grass, and the mesa was a black shape against stars so dense and brilliant they looked unreal. Mae had grown up under the washed-out skies of a city, and she had not been prepared for what New Mexico looked like at night. The sheer immensity of it, the way it made everything human and small and also somehow more essential. "Tell me something," she said. She was not sure why she said it. "Tell me something that has nothing to do with the ranch or the estate or Harlan Cade." Simon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I was 17, my uncle brought me out here for the first time. I had grown up in Ohio, and I had never seen country like this. He stopped the wagon on the top of the ridge over there," he gestured vaguely westward, "and he told me that the land did not belong to men. He said men belonged to the land, and the best they could do was tend it faithfully and try not to do too much damage before they were done with it." "He sounds like he was a good man," Mae said. "He was a complicated man. He was not always kind, but he was always honest eventually." Simon paused. "I believe he inserted the marriage clause in the will because he thought I would not be capable of this, of staying, of building something that mattered." He looked at his hands on the ledger. "I am not sure he was wrong about who I was when he wrote it." "And now," Mae said, the question hung between them in the lamplight like something with weight and substance. "Now," Simon said slowly, "I think I may have been sent something I do not deserve." Mae looked at him. Her practical heart, the heart that had learned to keep its own counsel in the interest of survival, did something inconvenient and involuntary in her chest. She stood up from the desk. "We should sleep," she said. "Whitmore will have a response from Las Cruces within the week, and we should be ready to move quickly when we have the account records." "Yes," Simon said. He was still looking at her. She took the lamp and walked to the east wing, and she lay in the dark listening to the night sounds of a territory that was nothing like what she had imagined when she was standing on a platform in St. Louis holding a westbound ticket. And she thought about how strange it was that the place you ended up could feel more like yourself than the place you had always been. The records arrived from Las Cruces 12 days later, carried by a rider Whitmore had sent personally rather than trusting to the Postal Service. Edgar Whitmore was a small, extremely precise man in his 50s, who arrived with the rider and sat in the parlor with me and Simon for 3 hours going through what the Territorial Bank had provided. The Southern Partnership account, as Mae had suspected, told a story very different from the one Harlan Cade had been presenting in court. The account had been established in 1878 as a grazing profit-sharing arrangement, and from 1878 through 1880, one Cade had received regular payments that, in aggregate, represented compensation for the grazing access he had provided to Bancroft cattle on his adjacent land before Cornelius had acquired the southern parcels outright. The account had been closed in 1882, 8 months before Cornelius died, with a final settlement payment. The closing entry, written in Cornelius's hand, noted finalization of all outstanding obligations under the Southern Partnership Agreement. "Finalization of all outstanding obligations," Edgar Whitmore said, and allowed himself a very small, very attorney-like smile. "He paid Cade off," Simon said. "Your uncle settled the account completely. Whatever private agreements existed between them were compensated in full prior to his death. The claim Cade is pressing in court is based on agreements that were already resolved." "Can you use this to have the challenge dismissed?" Mae asked. "Not immediately. We will need to file a motion and present these records before the territorial judge in Santa Fe, but yes, I believe we have a very strong argument for dismissal." Whitmore looked at me with an expression of professional admiration that he was also trying to keep very attorney-like. "Mrs. Bancroft, this would not have been found without your work in the ledgers." "The ledgers found it," Mae said. "I only looked." After Whitmore left, Simon and Mae stood on the porch in the warm May afternoon, and the ranch stretched out before them in every direction, the grass still green from the late rains, the cattle moving in the middle distance like slow, dark thoughts. "It is almost over," Simon said. He sounded as though he was not sure how he felt about that. Mae looked at him. She had been looking at him differently for the past several weeks, and she was aware of this, and she was also aware that he had been looking at her differently, and the awareness of mutual looking was a kind of intimacy that no legal document had prepared her for. "It is almost resolved," she said. "That is different from over." He turned to look at her. The May sun was behind her, and she was aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, of how near they were standing to each other. They had closed distance gradually over the weeks, the way two people who are initially wary will slowly stop maintaining quite as much deliberate space between them. "Me," he said. The careful, measured man who kept his worst impulses in the ledger to remind himself of what he was capable of. The man who had sat on the edge of a hearth and told her the truth when lying would have been so much easier, looked at her with an expression that stripped away every practical calculation and showed her something unguarded and essential. "I owe you more than I can account for in any ledger." "You do not owe me anything," she said. "We had an arrangement. We are honoring it." "That is not what this is anymore." His voice was very quiet. "You know that." She knew that. She had known it for at least 2 weeks. The knowing had been sitting in her chest like an ember she had been very carefully not looking at, because looking at it would require her to decide what to do with it, and she was not yet certain she was brave enough for the decision. "Simon," she said, "I need you to understand something about my situation. I came here because I had no good options. I am staying here because I chose to, but I will not." She started again. "I have been practical my whole life because I have had to be. I managed my father's accounts, and I managed his debts, and I managed the sale of his house, and I managed the train ticket and the agency fees and the $40, and all of it with clear eyes and a steady hand because that is who I am. But I am also," the ember was very bright now, "I am also a woman who would like, at least once, to do something because it is true rather than because it is sensible." Simon Bancroft stepped toward her. He stopped when there was a foot of space between them, because he was a man who asked permission with his proximity before he asked it with words. "Is this true?" he said. Mee looked up at him. The practical, careful, unillusioned woman who had arrived in Redemption, New Mexico territory, with a carpetbag and $40 and no expectation of being swept away by anything, said, "Yes." Inconveniently and somewhat infuriatingly, yes. He kissed her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. It was not theatrical. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had decided something and was committing to it completely. And Mee, who had not been kissed since before her father's illness had consumed the last 18 months, kissed him back with an honesty that surprised them both. When they stepped apart, the afternoon was still exactly the same afternoon, the grass still green and the cattle still moving and the creek still running clear, and everything was also completely different. "Well," Mee said, because she needed to say something, and that was what came out. Simon laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh without restraint, and it transformed his face entirely, made him look younger and freer and like someone who had been waiting for permission to feel something good for a long time. "Well," he agreed. The legal proceedings in Santa Fe moved through the territorial courts with the grinding momentum of all legal proceedings, which is to say slowly and with enormous amounts of paper. But Edgar Whitmore was persistent, and the evidence was unambiguous. And in July of 1883, the territorial judge ruled in favor of the Bancrofts and dismissed Harlan Cade's challenge with prejudice. The ruling was 3 pages long and dry as dust in its legal language, but its meaning was crystalline. The Bancroft estate was secure. The water rights were confirmed. The southern parcels belonged entirely and without encumbrance to Simon and Mee Bancroft. Mee read the ruling twice, sitting at the desk in the study, and then she put it down and sat very still for a moment and felt the relief move through her like water through dry ground. Cade was not gracious about the loss. He left the territory within a month of the ruling, relocating his operations to Colorado, and Mee understood that this was probably for the best for everyone involved. His departure was not celebrated at the ranch, because Simon was not the kind of man who celebrated other people's defeats. But there was a quiet shift in the atmosphere of the place, a release of something that had been held taut for a very long time. The months between July and October of 1883 were the months in which Mae Bancroft became, fully and without reservation, a woman who lived in Redemption, New Mexico territory. Not a woman who had arrived there, not a woman making the best of an arrangement, a woman who had made a home. The ranch was demanding, and she was glad of the demand. She took over the accounts entirely, which freed Simon to focus on the management of the cattle operation and the grazing contracts, and the division of labor made both of them more effective. She learned to bake cornbread in the cast iron skillet over the fire, and she learned to read the sky for weather the way Tamaz had been reading it for 30 years. And she learned the names of every plant that grew within a mile of the house, and what each of them was good for, and what each of them would do to a cow that ate too much of it. She learned, gradually and with great attention, the complicated landscape of Simon Bancroft's interior, the parts of him that were cautious, and the parts that were generous, and the parts that still carried old damage from years of feeling like the wanderer his uncle feared he would always be. She fell in love with him the way she did most things, thoroughly and without fanfare, and it was not a single moment but an accumulation of moments. It was the morning he drove 40 minutes each way to the trading post in the dark, because she had mentioned the previous evening that she had a headache, and he had noticed that the medicinal powder supply was low, and he was not willing to wait for the weekly supply run. It was the afternoon he sat with her on the porch, and read aloud to her from a newspaper from Santa Fe, and then spent an hour discussing the editorial she disagreed with, arguing her position with the respect of a man who took her opinions seriously. It was the evening she found him in the barn with Felix, patiently teaching the young man from Illinois to rope a post, with a kindness and a patience that was quiet and consistent and asked for no acknowledgement. It was the night she woke up to find him sitting at the desk in the study in the small hours, and when she asked him what was wrong he told her he had been thinking about the letter. The draft letter to Cade. He said he thought about it sometimes when he was sleeping, and it woke him up, the version of himself that had been tempted by that plan, and he did not like waking up next to that version. He sat down on the edge of the cot he still kept in the study even though he had not slept on it in weeks. "You did not send it," she said, "but I wrote it." "Simon," she waited until he looked at her. "You are going to have to decide at some point whether you are the man who burned the letter or the man who wrote it. And I will tell you now that the man I have been living beside for 6 months is the man who burned it. That is the man who is real." He looked at her for a long time in the lamp glow of the small hours. Then he came and sat beside her on the cot, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the dark began to thin toward morning. "Come to bed properly," she said eventually. He came. By autumn, the East Wing bedroom was his bedroom too, and the study held only the desk and the ledgers and the books and the old cot which had been repurposed as a shelf for Mae's growing collection of botanical samples, because she had discovered that the New Mexico high desert was botanically extraordinary, and she intended to document it. October brought the first cool nights and the stunning, violent colors of the desert in the season's change, and Mae sat on the porch in the evenings and felt the particular quality of contentment that comes from a life that has been assembled from real materials and earned rather than handed over. There was nothing easy about what she had done, nothing comfortable about the choice to stay in a situation that had initially been deceptive, nothing simple about the long weeks of legal anxiety and physical labor and emotional navigation. But she had stayed because she chose to, and everything that came from that choice was genuinely hers. Simon found her on the porch one October evening with his hat in his hands and the expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was about to say something important. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Then sit down," she said. "You look like you are about to testify." He sat beside her. The sky was turning colors that still, 6 months in, made her feel as though she were watching something almost too beautiful to bear. "When I wrote to the matrimonial agency," he said, "I told them what I needed: practical, educated, independent, and that was true. Those were the qualities I thought the situation required." He paused. "But I want you to know that what I actually sent for, even though I did not have the words for it then, was someone I could respect. Someone who would not let me be less than I was capable of being. Someone who would find the evidence in the ledger and lay it on the desk and say, 'Explain yourself.'" Me looked at him sidelong. "That is a very specific wish list for a matrimonial advertisement." "I know." The corner of his mouth moved toward a smile. "I got lucky." "You got me," she said. "I am not sure those are the same thing." "They are exactly the same thing." She looked at him. He was looking at her. The October evening was going gold, and the land ran out in every direction, 1,200 acres of it, and it belonged to both of them, which meant it belonged to neither of them in the solitary way that made land a burden rather than a gift. "I love you," she said. She said it simply, in the plain voice she used for things that were true and not in dispute. "I want you to know that. Not because it is sensible and not because it satisfies a legal requirement, because it is true." Simon Bancroft, who had grown up being told he had the soul of a wanderer, who had written a letter he was ashamed of and kept it where he could see it, who had sent for a wife because he needed one, and received instead someone who changed every assumption he had ever held about what he was capable of, looked at Mae Quinn and said, "I have loved you since the evening you sat at that desk, and found what was hiding in the accounts, and did not do it to impress me or to please me, but simply because you are the kind of person who does the work as completely as it can be done." "That," she said, "is possibly the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." He laughed. She laughed. The October sky did something magnificent overhead, and neither of them was watching it because they were watching each other, which was better. The winter of 1883 at the Bancroft Ranch was the kind of winter that made New Mexico reveal its less hospitable qualities. With cold that came down off the Malpai Ridge without apology, and 2 weeks of snow in December that isolated the ranch from the town, and required the full cooperation of everyone on the property to keep the cattle alive. Me worked alongside Tamaz and Felix and the other hands without complaint, and she learned that working hard alongside people in difficult conditions was the fastest way to earn their genuine respect rather than their polite regard. By the time the snow broke in January, old Pete told her she had more sand than most men he had ever worked with, which she accepted as the high compliment it was intended to be. In February, she told Simon that she was expecting a child. He was in the barn when she told him, examining a fence post that needed to be replaced, and the news arrived in the middle of what was very much an ordinary moment, which was, she thought, the right way for something enormous to arrive. He set down the post slowly and turned to look at her with an expression that moved through several phases too quickly for her to track them all, and then he came to her and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead with a tenderness so complete it made her eyes sting. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "You are sure?" "Simon, I am a woman who kept meticulous accounts for 12 years, I am sure." He put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and the barn smelled of hay and horses and the cold, clean air of a New Mexico February, and she thought about how strange and right it was to be here, in this place that had seemed like a trap and had turned out to be the truest thing she had ever found. The pregnancy proceeded with the brisk efficiency that characterized Me's approach to most things. She did not stop working in the accounts or around the ranch until she physically needed to, which was not until late July. She corresponded regularly with Edgar Whitmore about the estate records, and she had, by spring, implemented a filing system for the ranch documents that Whitmore told Simon was the finest organizational structure he had seen in 30 years of territorial law practice. Simon passed this compliment on to me with great satisfaction, and she received it with great pleasure. The summer brought its heat and its thunderstorms and the spectacular wildflower blooms that Mae had learned to anticipate, and she sat on the porch in the evenings with her botanical journal and her growing correspondence with a botanist at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, who had expressed serious interest in her documentation of the high desert flora of the Malpai region. This correspondence was a source of enormous satisfaction to her. It was something entirely her own, built from her own curiosity in her own time, and it was becoming something real and valuable in the world beyond the ranch, which she thought was important. A person needed to be something beyond the place they lived, even when they loved the place they lived. Simon read her botanical notes with genuine interest, and occasionally rode out with her to particular plants she wanted to examine more closely, holding her sample cases and her measuring tools and demonstrating a patience for her detailed observation that she appreciated enormously. He was not a man who pretended interest he did not feel, and his interest in her work was real, which made it meaningful. Their son was born on the 1st of September, 1884, in the East Wing bedroom with a midwife from Redemption named Mrs. Cordero, who had delivered half the children in the territory and approached the business with serene authority. Simon was present, which was unusual for the era, but he had simply stated his intention to be there, and Mae had not argued with him, and Mrs. Cordero had given him a look, and then let him stay because he was clearly not going to be a problem. He was not a problem. He held Mae's hand for 6 hours and did not faint once, which she told him later was an achievement she genuinely respected. They named the boy Cornelius James Bancroft, the first name for his great-uncle whose meticulous ledgers had saved the estate he had built, and the second name for Mae's father, who had not been a careful man but who had loved her and given her the skills that had made her formidable. The boy arrived into the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression of concentrated assessment, and from the first moment Mae held him, she felt the specific, annihilating love that she had heard described and had not believed in until it was real. Simon sat beside her on the bed in the small hours of that September morning with his son in his arms and looked at the boy with an expression so open and unguarded that Mae felt she was seeing something she would carry for the rest of her life, the face of a man who had expected to be a wanderer and had instead become the center of something. "He looks like he is planning something," Simon said. "He looks like you," Mae said. "That is what I said." She laughed quietly because the baby was sleeping, and Simon smiled at her over their son's head with everything in his face that he had learned to stop hiding. The years that followed at the Bancroft Ranch were full in every sense of the word, full of work and weather, and the ongoing management of a living operation that was always asking something of the people who tended it, full of the accumulation of small daily things that were the actual substance of a life rather than its dramatic moments. Mae's correspondence with the botanist in Albuquerque developed into a genuine professional relationship, and in 1886, her documentation of the high desert flora of the Malpai region was published as a monograph by the University of New Mexico, which made her the first woman to publish a scientific work through that institution. She received a letter of congratulation from the university president that she kept in the ledger with Cornelius's meticulous accounts, because it seemed like the right place for it. Edgar Whitmore retired in 1886 and recommended a young attorney named Alvarez in Santa Fe who was, he said, extremely capable and very unlikely to allow any future Harlan Cads to gain any purchase whatsoever on the Bancroft estate. Alvarez proved to be everything Whitmore had promised, and also someone whom he found professionally congenial because he approached legal strategy with the same methodical rigor she brought to the accounts. Tomás Reyes remained as foreman for many years, and old Pete continued to predict rain with uncanny accuracy until he retired to his daughter's house in Las Cruces in 1887. Felix from Illinois learned to rope and ride, and eventually decided that New Mexico suited him and bought a small place of his own down the road, which he ran with quiet competence. Young Cornelius, whom everyone called Neil by the time he was 3 because Cornelius was a great deal of name for a small person, turned out to be a child of extraordinarily strong opinions and tremendous energy, which his parents found exhausting and hilarious in roughly equal measure. He had his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness, and his own particular quality of absolute certainty about things that was sometimes correct and sometimes spectacularly incorrect, and always passionate. He loved the land with the same bone-deep attachment Simon had, and by the time he was 5, he was following Tomas around the operation asking questions that the foreman answered with the patient gravity of a man who understood he was teaching the next generation. In the spring of 1887, Mae told Simon they were expecting again. This time she told him at the desk in the study, while they were going over the quarterly accounts together, and he received the news with the same quality of attention he brought to everything important, turning fully toward her from the ledger, and saying with great deliberateness and warmth, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am also noting that this is going to require us to think about the arrangement of the east wing, because Neil's room is too small for 2 children." "You have already been thinking about the renovation," he said, "for approximately 3 weeks." He smiled at her. "Of course you have." Their daughter was born that November, and they named her Clara, which had been the name of Mae's grandmother, and which Mae had always carried as a private affection. Clara arrived in the world with a set of lungs that made her opinion of the process extremely clear, and settled almost immediately into an imperious calm that suggested she had assessed the situation and found it acceptable, which was a quality that seemed appropriate for a Bancroft. Neil regarded his sister with the complex combination of fascination and territorial suspicion common to elder children, and within 2 weeks had appointed himself her primary protector, a role he took with the utmost seriousness. Mae watched her son sit beside his sister's cradle and explain to her, in a careful voice, how the ranch worked and what she would need to know, and she thought about Cornelius Bancroft explaining to a 17-year-old Simon that the land did not belong to men but men belonged to the land, and she thought about lineage and what it actually meant, and she felt something in her chest that she could only describe as deep and completed. The Bancroft Ranch in 1888 was a thriving operation that Mae had half built through her management of its accounts and legal standing, and it was also a household of 4 people who were, in the ways that actually mattered, genuinely happy. Not in the theatrical way of people performing happiness for an audience, in the quiet, substantial way of people who have built something real and know it, and are grateful for it without being sentimental about it. Simon had become what his uncle had wanted him to become, a man rooted in a place and committed to it, though he had become it in his own way, and through his own choices, rather than through any coercion the will had attempted. He was a good rancher and a good neighbor, and, increasingly, a man that other ranchers in the region sought out for counsel on water rights and grazing management, because he had navigated the legal landscape of the territory with more sophistication than most, and people recognized that. He sat on the Territorial Livestock Board for 3 years, and he attended the Mesilla Park Agricultural College lectures when they came to the region, and he corresponded with a professor there about breeding programs for high desert cattle, which was a genuine intellectual passion that Mae had encouraged when she first discovered it, because she believed absolutely that people should pursue the things that genuinely interested them. He was also, in the ways that had nothing to do with business or reputation, a man who came home to his family with the same quality of complete attention he brought to the work, who read to Neil and Clara in the evenings and took them riding on weekends, and who had a habit, which he had developed seemingly without noticing it, of touching Mae's hand when he passed her in the house, a brief, casual, entirely habitual gesture that she had come to understand was his way of confirming, without requiring the moment to carry any drama, that she was there and that he was glad of it. Mae, in turn, had become something she had not expected to become when she had stood on a platform in St. Louis holding a westbound ticket. She had become a woman who was known in the territory for her work in the accounts and for her botanical publication, and for her clear, practical handling of the Cade situation, the story of which had spread through the ranching community with the speed that good stories always traveled, and which had given her a reputation for both intelligence and nerve that opened more doors than it closed. She was known in her household as a woman who was fair and demanding and funny in a dry way that caught people off guard, and deeply loving in a way that was not demonstrative, but was completely consistent and could be relied upon absolutely. She was known to herself, which was the most important thing. She was someone she recognized when she looked in the mirror in the East Wing bedroom, and she found the woman she saw there to be genuine and to have been worth the trouble of becoming. In the spring of 1889, the year New Mexico Territory was taking its first tentative steps toward the statehood that would come 2 decades later, Edgar Whitmore's replacement Alvarez came to the ranch with a proposal from a consortium of ranchers in the region who wanted to establish a formal water rights cooperative that would serve 12 operations in the Malpai watershed. The proposal was legally complex and politically sensitive, and Alvarez was frank about the fact that it needed someone with both the legal standing and the practical credibility to anchor it. Mae read the proposal in the study and then went out to the porch where Simon was sitting with Neil, who was 4.5, and at the stage of childhood where he narrated everything he was doing in a continuous, earnest commentary that Mae found both endearing and occasionally exhausting. "Come read this when you have a moment," she said. He came in after an hour with Neil trotting beside him still commentating, and he read the proposal at the desk while Mae fed Clara in the chair by the window and watched his face work through the document. "This is significant," he said. "It is also right," she said. "The water rights in this watershed affect everyone downstream of us. A cooperative is the logical structure. You want us to anchor it. I think we are well positioned to anchor it," she said carefully. "The Bancroft estate has the water rights with the clearest documentation and the most legally established standing in the region. And I think Cornelius would have found it appropriate to use that standing in the service of something that benefits the whole community." Simon looked at her across the study, across the desk covered in ledgers and correspondence, across the room where she had sat in the lamplight 6 years ago, and found the evidence that saved the estate and changed everything. He looked at her with the expression she knew so well now, the expression of a man for whom love had turned out to mean being known by someone who saw him fully and chose him anyway. "You have already written the initial framework, haven't you?" he said. "Only in draft form," she said. "Me. It still needs your input on the grazing rotation specifics. Me. And we should discuss the governance structure before I finalize anything." "I love you tremendously," he said. "I love you too," she said. "Now come look at the governance framework because I have a question about the legal precedent in the 1882 Territorial Water Act that Alvarez was not entirely clear on." He sat beside her, and Clara reached out a small, imperious hand and grabbed his finger and held it with the strength of a 7-month-old who had decided this was the thing she wanted to hold. And Neil climbed onto the other chair and began narrating the document over Simon's shoulder with great authority and no comprehension whatsoever. And the study in the Bancroft ranch house in the spring of 1889 was full of the particular warmth of a family that had been built from nothing certain into something absolutely real. The water rights cooperative took 2 years to formalize, because legal structures involving 12 separate ranching operations and the territorial government and the question of federal oversight of Western water resources were not simple in 1889 and were not simple in 1891 either. But Mae and Alvarez and Simon worked through it with the persistence that the situation required. And in March of 1891, the Malpai Watershed Cooperative was formally established with Simon Bancroft as its first chair and Mae Bancroft as its legal records manager, a title that significantly undersold what she actually did, which was essentially serve as the operational mind of the entire enterprise. The cooperative was, in the years that followed, a genuine success. It managed the water access for 12 ranching families in the watershed with a fairness and efficiency that was held up in territorial government discussions as a model for how such things could be done. And there were moments when Mae sat at the cooperative's quarterly meetings and looked around the table at 12 families who were not fighting over water because they had a structure that made fighting unnecessary. And she felt the particular satisfaction of work that had worked. The darker history was not forgotten. It was not the territory's way to forget the contests over land and water that had defined its character, but it was transformed, which was perhaps the best that could be asked of any dark history. Cornelius Neal Bancroft grew up to be a rancher, which surprised no one. By the time he was 15, he was doing actual work on the operation rather than supplementary work, and by the time he was 18, he was managing the summer grazing rotation with a competence that Tomás's successor, a man named Delgado who had worked with Tomás for years, acknowledged with the respect due a young man who had both learned properly and was willing to work. Neal had his mother's precision with numbers and his father's instinct for the land, and the combination made him formidable in ways that would only become fully apparent as he grew older. Clara grew up to be a doctor. This was not something anyone had predicted specifically, but looking back, Mae thought she should have. Clara had her father's quality of focused attention and her mother's systematic approach to understanding things. And she had, from a young age, a particular interest in why things went wrong biologically, that she had initially applied to her brother's frequent minor injuries, and eventually channeled into a genuine pursuit. She left for the women's medical program in Chicago at 19, which was 1907, and she corresponded with her parents twice a week and came home for Christmas and for branding season, because Clara Bancroft was, under her scientific precision, still a ranch girl who liked to be useful. Mae and Simon were 52 and 57 respectively in 1909. And the Bancroft Ranch was as fully established as an operation could be, with a reputation in the territory that was the kind that takes generations to build, but had been built in the span of one marriage, because both halves of that marriage had worked at it with everything they had. On a September evening in 1909, 25 years after the birth of their son Neal, Mae sat on the porch of the ranch house in the last golden light of a New Mexico autumn and felt the weight and the satisfaction of the years all at once. Simon came out and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and the newspaper from Albuquerque, because the train came through Redemption now and brought the paper 2 days late but still fresh enough to matter, and he put 1 cup in her hands and unfolded the paper and then did not read it, because he was looking at the sky the same way she was. 26 years, she said. Since the letter, he said. Since I found it in the ledger and you sat on the hearth and told me the truth. I have thought many times about what would have happened if you had left, he said. That evening, if you had taken the $32 and gone. I thought about it. I know. I stayed because it was the logical choice, she said. My options were limited. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. And then, he said, and then, she said, I stayed because it was the true choice, which is different. He reached over and took her hand. The gesture was exactly as casual and exactly as essential as it had always been. She turned her hand to hold his and they sat in the October evening with the coffee and the unread newspaper and the mesa going copper and the creek running below, which had run reliable for all the years they had been there and would run on after them. We should write to Clara, Mae said. We should. And there is the cooperative's quarterly report to review. There is. And Delgado mentioned something about the fence line on the south parcel that needs addressing before the winter. He did. But not tonight, she said. "No," Simon said, "not tonight." The sky did what it always did in the New Mexico evening, made something extraordinary out of ordinary light and ordinary air, and the particular geography of that place. And Mae Bancroft, who had been Mae Quinn, who had stood on a platform in St. Louis with $40 and a practical heart and a westbound ticket, looked at it without trying to analyze it, simply looked at it and let it be beautiful, and held her husband's hand in the last of the warmth of the day. She had come to settle an estate. She had settled in the end far more than that. She had settled herself into the shape of a life that was genuinely, fully, and without reservation her own. She had settled the legal standing of 1,200 acres and the futures of 12 families along a watershed. She had settled, slowly and honestly, and with considerable patience on both sides, the contested territory between two people who had each come to the arrangement with hidden histories and dark fears, and the kind of wounds that only heal when someone else is willing to look at them without flinching. She had settled, by which she meant she had built, a marriage that was a genuine partnership and a home that was a genuine place, and a family that was the realest thing she had ever made. The letter in the ledger had been a dark impulse that a man had not sent. But it had also been the thing she found, and the finding had made them honest with each other from the first night, had stripped away the possibility of comfortable performance, and required them both to be what they actually were, which had turned out to be people who were together considerably more than they were separately. In the spring of 1911, Neil married a woman named Rosario Delgado, the daughter of the foreman, who had grown up on the ranch and knew its rhythms and its demands, and who was, in Mae's estimation, exactly the kind of woman her son needed, clear-eyed and steady and entirely unwilling to allow Neil's occasional stubbornness to go unchallenged. Mae told Simon this, and he said he thought that sounded familiar, and Mae said she had no idea what he meant by that. Clara returned from Chicago with her medical degree in 1912 and established a practice in Redemption, which the town had needed and not had for 12 years, and which she ran with the same focused authority she brought to everything. She also, in 1913, married a teacher from the school in town named Marcus Webb, who was quiet and kind and had an excellent library, and whom Clara regarded with the specific warmth of someone who had found exactly the right complement to her own nature. Neil and Rosario had their first child in 1913, a boy they named Joseph, who arrived into the world with a pair of lungs that Neil said were clearly inherited from his mother's side of the family, and Rosario said were clearly inherited from his father's side, and which Mae thought were simply the lungs of a Bancroft, which had always been a family that made itself heard. Mae held her grandson in the East Wing bedroom, which had been her bedroom since a few weeks after her arrival in 1883, and the room was 30 years older and held 30 years of accumulated presents, books and botanical journals, and the copy of Jane Eyre with the broken spine that she still had, the correspondence files and the framed letter from the University of New Mexico, and the small collection of desert stones she had gathered over the years for no other reason than that they were beautiful. Simon came in and sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his grandson with the expression she knew so well, the open and unguarded one that he had stopped trying to control sometime in the early years of their marriage when he had understood that she did not require him to perform composure. "He looks like he is planning something," Simon said. Mae looked at Joseph Bancroft, 6 hours old and already regarding the world with a suspiciously focused gaze. "He looks like you," she said. "His grandmother's opinion," Simon said, "is not objective." "No," she agreed, "it is not." She was not objective. She had not been objective since somewhere around the 5th week, sitting in the study with the lamp burning low, when she had looked up from the ledger and found him watching her, and had held the gaze one beat too long. She had not been objective since the first morning he drove 40 minutes in the dark for medicine she might need, or the evening on the porch when the October sky turned colors that had no name, or the long years of working beside each other through drought and legal battles, and the raising of children and the building of something that would outlast them both. She was not objective about Simon Bancroft, whom she had married in a brief, unsentimental ceremony in the parlor of his uncle's house, because they were two practical people who needed each other's particular practicalities, and who she had stayed for because she chose to, and who she had loved from somewhere in the space between the first difficult evening and the second cup of coffee at the desk, and who she would love for every remaining year of her life, with the same consistency and depth and unperforming honesty that had been the characteristic of everything the two of them had built together. The Bancroft Ranch sat at the foot of the Malpai Ridge for many years after that, through the end of the territorial period and into statehood in 1912, through the changes that came to the region as the century turned, and it was tended by people who understood that the land did not belong to men, but that men could belong to the land if they took the responsibility of it seriously. Neil ran the operation and managed it well. The cooperative his parents had established continued to function, and was eventually cited in the legal framework of the State Water Rights Act as a model for cooperative management. Mae's botanical monograph was reprinted in 1920 and cited in university courses on southwestern ecology. She was invited to speak at the university in Albuquerque in 1921, and she went, at 64 years old, and she spoke with the clear, direct voice she had always had about the high desert flora of the Malpai region, and what 30 years of careful observation had taught her about how things survived in difficult conditions, by adapting to what was actually available rather than requiring what was not. She thought, after the lecture, that this was probably also a description of how she had built a life. Simon met her at the train when she came back from Albuquerque, which was the kind of thing he had always done, the kind of practical, consistent, entirely reliable gesture that was the actual language of his love for her, and she stepped off the train onto the platform of the redemption station and saw him there in the afternoon light. 69 years old and still carrying himself with the slight forward lean that she had thought on the first evening was guilt and had eventually understood was simply the posture of a man who was always moving toward the next thing, and she walked to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "The lecture went well." "I know," he said. Alvarez's office sent a telegram. "The man is impossibly well connected." "He is," Simon agreed. "Are you tired?" "I am ready to be home," she said. He drove her home through the evening country, through the Malpai grass that was still green in the October way it had always been, and the mesa caught the last light the same way it had always caught it, and the creek ran below the south pasture where the water rights were clear and documented, and no longer in dispute, and the ranch house sat at the end of the road with lights in the windows because Neil and Rosario were there with young Joseph and his new little sister, born that spring. And Clara and Marcus were coming for supper, and the east wing bedroom was exactly where it had always been with the books and the journals and the copy of Jane Eyre and the 38 years of accumulated presents that was the record of a life built honestly from difficult materials into something that would stand. Mae Bancroft looked at her home through the window of the wagon and felt the whole weight of it, the whole good complicated earned weight of it, and she reached over without looking and found her husband's hand on the reins and covered it with her own, and he turned his hand to hold hers, the same gesture he had made for 38 years, casual and essential, and she thought about a woman who had stood on a train platform in St. Louis with $40 and a practical heart and a decision to make. She had made the right decision, not because it had been safe or easy or without the possibility of becoming the trap she had feared it might be. She had made the right decision because she had made it with her eyes open, and she had stayed with her eyes open, and she had built what she had built with the full force of everything she was, and the man beside her had met her there with the full force of everything he was, and together they had been enough. More than enough. The wagon rolled down the road toward home, and the New Mexico evening closed around them with its extraordinary, unsentimental beauty, and everything that had needed to be settled was, at last and fully, settled.